verses 4 to 9. Moses convened all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances that I am addressing to you today. You shall learn them and observe them diligently. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain, out of the fire. At that time I was standing between the Lord and you to declare to you the words of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up the mountain." And he said, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents, to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not quit anyone who misuses his name. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slaves may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother, as the Lord your God commanded you, so that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God has given you. You shall not murder, nor shall you commit adultery. Neither shall you steal. Neither shall you bear false witness against your neighbor. Neither shall you covet your neighbor's wife. Neither shall you desire your neighbor's house, or field, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children, and talk about them when you are at home, and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Here ends the reading. A contemporary word. Love is the most ancient law, Jan Richardson. Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. Love is the most ancient law, a blessing. Open to it, and you will know how love is its own blessing and most ancient of laws. Pursue it entirely with everything in you, your heart, all, your soul, all, your mind, all. Spend it all, this love, so generous, this love that goes out to each, it finds this love, that gives itself in lavish and unimagined measure everywhere, and to all, yourself not least."
Well, with such long readings, I imagine you're looking forward to a long sermon. These texts, the Deuteronomy texts, are some of the most well-known and continually challenging words that we have from the Bible. Where we are, last week we were in Exodus, and Moses had just been called to go and rescue, deliver the people from slavery in Egypt. And since last week in the Bible, we have gone through the rest of Exodus, the whole book of Leviticus, the whole book of Numbers, and now we're into the book of Deuteronomy. And if you remember the story, at least in a little bit of detail, the Israelites spent 40 years wandering in the desert before they were able to come into the land of Canaan. It would have been about a 3-week trip if they had just walked there. So there was something holy, mysterious, challenging going on there. But now they are on the hills to the east of the Jordan River. Moses is there giving his last talks. And what he introduces here, what we call the 10 Commandments, what we call the Shema. These texts are foundational in our tradition. I don't think that we recite them daily as the scripture tells us to, but I think it's interesting to wonder as often as we can where we are in the sense of our spirit in this world. Just before Moses starts into this sermon with the commandments, he's kind of given a report on where they've been and what's happened. And I thought this morning that it might be good to think about where we've been and what has just happened. And I opened the front page of the New York Times this morning. And there I saw the headline, Israel formally declares war, combined death toll passes 900. I saw an analysis article, amid labor standoff, one question, are employers miscalculating? They've been taken aback by the tactics and the tougher negotiating style of the union leaders. Entire villages razed as death toll soars from quakes in Afghanistan. Already 813 confirmed deaths. And an opinion piece by 4 leaders from Africa who say, if you want our countries to address climate change, first, pause our debts. You know, while the U.S. was supporting their people during the pandemic these last 4 years, African countries, too, had to shut down, but they didn't have the resources to do that. And in fact, they went further into debt to the international banks and so on. And at this point, they say that their debt repayments will be $62 billion this year. So Africa is now paying more in debt service than the estimated $50 billion a year that the Global Center on Adaptation says it needs to invest in climate resilience. And the last one I'm pulling up here wasn't quite on the front page, but I thought it was relevant because we've been talking a bit about how expectations that technology can save us are distracting us from what really needs to be done. And this one is called The Wager That Betting Can Change the World. So there's a group of tech insiders who believe that prediction markets can fix social ills. That is, by just betting on what's likely to happen, we'll find out what's really going on. If somebody knows their news is wrong, they won't bet on it. So we'll be able then to make better decisions because these betting markets will show us what's really happening. I don't have to tell you, I think that's as distracting as the idea that we'll all go to Mars. But that's the setting we find ourselves in. And our task is to find, where do these commandments speak to us in light of what's happening in our world today? Not to mention our individual personal lives, of course. I was interested, as I was doing research, as I always do, to learn that in medieval Ethiopia, the Coptic Christians celebrated both the Old Testament Sabbath and Christian Sunday. That is, they worked 5 days a week and observed 2 days a week of rest. Now, they did say that we don't observe the seventh-day Sabbath in the same way that the Jews do, but we do observe it. We have our ways of observing it. And of course, Sunday they called the Lord's Day, as did Christians in many places. So it was interesting to me to hear that, and to hear that term, seventh-day Sabbatarians, they were called, because there are Seventh-day Sabbatarians in our culture. We have the Seventh-day Baptists, the Seventh-day Adventists. Still, the churches in Ethiopia observe this seventh day. In Europe, especially in the English-speaking areas, were first-day Sabbatarians, and they began calling Sunday, the Lord, which most Christians called the Lord's Day, the Sabbath. That wasn't going to quite fly in the countries whose languages had been shaped by Latin. Think about it. In Spanish, Saturday is sábado. Saturday is Sabbath. So you couldn't quite call both Saturday and Sunday Sabbath in the Latin-speaking countries. So they never adopted that Sabbath idea. Oh, and then there were some, even Christians, who called themselves non-Sabbatarians. And they said that the church is free to establish a day of rest or not, and to establish a day of worship or not. I like this idea that Christians have tried to understand the meaning of Sabbath for themselves. And I did grow up in a church where I learned that Sunday was our Sabbath day. And I also learned, I was growing up in Massachusetts with a strong Puritan legacy, and I learned how the Puritans observed Sabbath, which was quite fierce. And there was certainly no play. It was all prayer and theology, perhaps helping others. But I think in our own time, we don't have to quite observe a Puritan Sabbath, but it is helpful for us to think about a Sabbath. It's a time when we can acknowledge our human condition, when we can participate in a community, and we can remember our reliance on God as we understand God, each one of us in our own ways. The Ten Commandments, as we have them now, were probably written, edited in the late 7th century BCE. This is around, it's called late 7th century, but it's the early numbers, 710, 720 BCE. And these commandments are modeled on what would have been called vassal treaties. So when a greater military power defeated a lesser one, that lesser country became a vassal to that, they called it a suzerain. They made a treaty. And in 722 BC, Northern Israel did fall to the Assyrians. Judah was threatened. The southern kingdom, Judah, was threatened. And this passage is making a claim. It's saying we already have a treaty with God. We can't sign a treaty with Assyria. So they are resisting the idea of signing a treaty with this great military power. One other fun thing about Deuteronomy, this book Deuteronomy, the word is hard to say, right? Is it Deuteronomy? I mean, what is this word, right? Deuteronomy. And it comes from two words, deutero, which means two, and nami, which means law. And this is the second time that the Israelites have received the Ten Commandments. And the versions are not exactly the same, and it's actually part of the reason I'm talking about the Sabbath, because in the first version, it said that the Israelites were to celebrate a Sabbath in honor of God resting on the seventh day of creation. Well, here, as you might have noted, or perhaps the words were going by too fast, but here in Deuteronomy, it says, because I have freed you from slavery in Egypt. And this is the celebration of your freedom from slavery. And that means that not only you get to have a day of freedom, but everyone. Did you notice that first it said you are free from slavery, and then it said you must give your slaves a day of rest? It feels contradictory here. It's helpful for us to remember a couple things about slavery in ancient times. One was that people just assumed it had to exist, that it was a way of sustaining people when they could not sustain themselves. You sold yourself into slavery, or a way of putting war captives to work. It wasn't until about 500 years ago that people started talking about that no one should be a slave. Slavery in that time meant that in the seventh year, you would be freed from slavery. It was called the Sabbath year, and all the slaves would be freed in that year. So it wasn't quite the continual slavery that we had in the U.S., and it did not have the same brutal or racial implications. So all that about Sabbath. Just a little more. In a way, this Sabbath commandment is the center of the whole Ten Commandments, because it reminds us to look back at the first three commandments about honoring God, one God, not using God's name in ways that distort God's purposes. Not making idols, not worshiping something other than God. And of course, when contemporary writers write about idols, they don't talk about statues of gods. They talk about worshiping money or the economy or a particular document like the U.S. Constitution, rather than worshiping God. So it looks back to those verses, but it also looks ahead to the next 6 verses, because all these verses, you shall not kill, steal, commit adultery, and so on. These are the ways that you recognize God's presence in your life by not abusing other people. The Sabbath is something that you do with your body. You stop working. And interestingly, there's nothing said here about how to observe other than to stop working. Now, in Ethiopia, they would cook 2 days' worth of food on Friday. So they would have food for their Saturday Sabbath and their Sunday Lord's Day. So there are traditions that have developed that certain kinds of work just should not be done on these days. But these passages are also saying this last commandment, which I think is widely misread. It's about not coveting. Now, coveting in Hebrew really doesn't mean wanting or desiring. It means, I'm going to quote from the prophet Micah to show you what it means, and then I'll explain myself. Woe to those who devise wickedness and evil deeds on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it because it is in their power. They covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They oppress householder and house, people and their inheritance. This word covet is talking about not a way of breaking the law by stealing, but a way of manipulating the law that makes it legitimate to take someone else's property. And that is similar to what the African countries face. In desperate need, they borrow money, and then other nations use that hold to control what they can do. And in this case, well-to-do landowners would loan money to small landowners. If they could not repay the debt, they would take the house or take the land that had been used as collateral. That's what coveting is. And coveting your neighbor's wife means taking your neighbor's wife as a slave. So we have misread that passage in many ways. And so when we talk about the 10 Commandments, what we're really talking about is not following the kind of predatory economic practices that our country has been following for the last 40 years. Practices which privilege the well-to-do, reduce their taxes, reduce their responsibility for our communal lives together. Laws that hold the minimum wage down, not only down, but below subsistence level. You cannot subsist on a minimum wage. And so many people on a minimum wage would have to, in order to support themselves, work on any Sabbath that they might otherwise have claimed. So this, Walter Brueggemann calls it a Pharaoh economy. They've been released from that, and they are being commanded to create a different kind of economy. Thou shalt not be acquisitive, is what it says, to resist this Pharaoh social system. It is that at this point, most of our government policy, most of our government representatives primarily represent those who are financially secure. Most of them are financially secure, and their ideas of the right legislation, unfortunately, do not recognize those in the U.S. and around the world from whom they, in essence, have legally stolen their wealth. This is a hard one for me because, I have a retirement fund that is invested in stocks. One of those ways that we take money that corporations earn and declare as earnings rather than pay their workers adequate wages. So this is a commandment I wrestle with personally. So what I see is that these 10 commandments, they are really about how to create a just society. That is, you don't take advantage of other people, either directly by stealing or killing, or indirectly by making it impossible for them to survive. And the way that you are able to keep doing this difficult thing is to remember the Sabbath day, to observe the Sabbath day, to take a day of rest along with everybody else, to contemplate what God has called us to do, what God has called us to follow. There are two versions, as I mentioned, of the Ten Commandments. One is in Exodus 20, the other here in Deuteronomy. Mostly they're pretty similar. One of my favorite writers, Maren Tirabassi, was playing around with Exodus 20. And she rewrote these commandments, and it is quite long. I won't read every word, but she begins, I am the Holy One of a world community. Don't claim precedence of any particular religion, or you may build a wall in place of an open door in your own heart. Don't make idols of money, power, tradition, and then bow down and worship them. Don't make a wrong use of God's name to justify your ideas, your politics, or your interpretation of ancient texts. Remember, the Sabbath means to rest your body, your mind, and your spirit, and create a society in which no one needs to work to exhaustion to feed themselves and their families. Honor all who are elderly. Listen to their wisdom, care for their well-being, for this is the only way to receive a heritage. You shall not kill with your death penalty. You shall not kill by making guns accessible. You shall not kill by starvation unnecessary in an abundant world. You shall not commit abuse in relationships, permit human trafficking, forbid love. You shall not steal land. We recognize we here are on unceded land of the Coast Miwok people, or cultural identity. You shall not steal a child's childhood by mistreating them. You shall not steal hope. And you shall not lie about the earth and what damages it. She made an 11th here. You shall not lie in the paying of taxes that sustain common life. You shall not lie about the weeping past of indigenous people. You shall not lie about the violent history of race. You shall not lie by taking books of honesty and hope from school desks and library shelves. You shall not lie in Congress, in court, in seeking office. You shall not invent lies about the future that steal our children's world. In a world so divided that the rich serve a gold calf brunch to their friends with the side of someone else's ewe lamb. We've got a couple Bible references in there. You shall not covet what you do not need. This Sabbath, these commandments are commandments to us, but they are also a gift. They're also a blessing. They're also a foundation on which our Christian tradition has been built and which Christians in every age have wrestled with, as we do today. But this gift, if, as Walter Brueggemann says, if it is centered in the Sabbath, if it is centered in taking a day when instead of being busy, accomplishing all the things around the house or all the tasks at work, a day that you rest in many ways, your body, your mind, your spirit, a day that you contemplate the essence of life, the deep foundations of our being, the meaning of our communities, the practices of our tradition, if this Sabbath can be a blessing for you, maybe you, and if it can be a blessing for me too, maybe we can indeed follow these commandments. Perhaps not perfectly, but with awareness. Because this is life. This is life. Finding ways to structure our lives rather than thinking that our freedom from slavery means that we should just do anything we want. This structure is what makes life in community possible. This is life. May it be so. We have an anthem today from Vivaldi,